Here's an interesting conundrum. Customer security is often perceived as the enemy of frictionless user experience, yet 81% of customers expect brands to offer it. This annoying step eats away at those precious seconds between a customer's interest in you and their impulse to move on. But if you don't offer it, they'll move on anyway. If they trust you, they'll engage with you more, but nearly 6 in 10 consumers are nervous that brands' use of technologies like AI will put their personal data at risk. Customer security is a little like being one of those 1950s plate spinners, spinning a bunch of plates on sticks, but now it seems we're doing this on the roof of a moving car as it accelerates along a bumpy road. I'm Steve Prentice, and this is the Thales Security Sessions podcast. To answer questions about trust in this era, it is my pleasure to welcome James Leighton Gray, the director at The Privacy Practice, a firm that specializes in privacy and data protection, as well as Haider Iqbal, who looks after product marketing for Thales Identity and Access Management business. So, welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Steve.
And welcome, Haider.
Thank you, Steve. Great to have this conversation with you and James today.
Okay, so Thales has come out with its 2024 Digital Trust Index report, and it has some really interesting statistics, some of which we may have expected and some of which may be just a little bit different than we did expect. And it's always so interesting to see what people are responding to. So to start off, for both of you, what are your primary observations about the report? Haider, if I may start with you, since you were so closely involved with it, was there anything new or surprising for you here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out for me was the acceptance of certain security controls, right? Historically speaking, when you're in the cybersecurity space, you're always facing this huge challenge that cybersecurity or security is such a boring sell. There's always fear mongering. If you don't use this security control, this is going to happen. But what I found really refreshing as part of the feedback during this survey was the audience themselves, as in the consumers or the users themselves, they're becoming a lot more knowledgeable about these controls as well. And they're kind of expecting them. And, this particular statistic about MFA, where something like 81% of users expect brands to offer MFA. And I looked at this stat, I was like, wow, here we're trying to convince sometimes our customers about the best practices of security and then having to use stuff like multi-factor authentication for authenticating their users. And these end consumers, they're literally doing the job for us. They're actually telling you that this is something that they now expect.
Well, I love the predictable but annoying capacity of human beings to contradict themselves. Because even when we got that statistic, the 81%, which I absolutely believe, I also know full well that some of those same people who are saying, yes, I really expect MFA, will also be the people who will be saying that it's frustrating. Because when we looked at some of the trust things, I'm sure we'll come on to them in a minute, but banking was high up. Banking was the top. And yet, in the list of frustrations, online frustrations, banking verification was on there at 46%. So people are essentially contradictory in this space. And I'm not surprised by that. We all want great public services and low taxes. And we know there's a slight tension between those two, but we still want it like that. I don't think this is surprising. I think it's how that balance is achieved by different brands, which is what's interesting, and also how the balance changes over time. So I'm sure Haider's right that if we look back to the survey, if it was being run 10 years ago, MFA would not have been anywhere near that level of acceptance, let alone sort of people saying it's a good thing. And yet that's where we are now. Fear, that's a good motivator. You're right also, Haida, understanding people are realizing now what the dangers are and that they can help protect themselves. So all of these factors change that environment, and the environment changes the desires or the acceptance.
Haider, from your perspective, does this give you confidence that there is indeed a greater level of consumer-based sophistication across the board? James seems to think that we are sitting on both sides of a fence, or, to mix metaphors somewhat, that we want to have our cake and eat it as well. Also, previous Thales reports on this topic have been focusing more on internal and industry people, but now we're looking also outwards. So are you optimistic that this will lead to greater overall security if consumers are indeed willing to deal with the perceived hassles of MFA or 2FA or even biometrics or face scanning? Or do you think simply that the threat actors will race alongside the trends and continue to outpace these Herculean efforts that we are trying to put out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that also strikes me from this report, that balance that James was referring to, I think it's absolutely crucial, right? And this is why one of the things that I would actually recommend to a lot of the readers is think about your own formula for trust, right? For your organization, for your industry, for your particular context. What is your formula for trust for your users? So for instance, in some cases, you can elevate the level of security, and then you might actually start seeing a decline in the number of users or the usage of your service, right? In other cases, stuff like banking, for instance, in healthcare, it's like a given. With the sensitivity of the data, you need to have those security controls in place, even if they are to introduce some form of friction. I'm very hopeful because even though customers expect best of both worlds, we have known this for the past 10 years, even more anyway, that customers do expect the best type of security that's out there. At the same time, the most frictionless experience. I think something that I can point out over here, a very specific example, is the work that is being done by the FIDO Alliance, for instance, which is explicitly looking at this point, right? There is the notion of security for sure. So you want to bring in authentication capabilities that are more phishing resistance, for instance. But then at the same time, there is that realization that if we really want mass adoption of these kind of tools and technologies, they need to be as frictionless as possible. And something that's happened quite recently because of the initiative from FIDO Alliance's passkeys, which have been introduced. And I would just call it something that actually replaces passwords, which not only makes your user experience a lot more frictionless, but then at the same time elevates your security as well. So yeah, we are actually coming up with solutions which are actually addressing both sides of the equation. And I am very, very bullish about these kind of initiatives.
I have to say, I'm not quite as cynical as I sound, because in this instance, I do agree. I think it's interesting and it's positive that we're seeing privacy enhancing technologies, and passkeys are undoubtedly a very forward thinking way of looking at that. And I would love to see that adopted elsewhere. But I just want to go back 1 second to the business of trust and how an individual company can look at trust. Because as security people, I'm sure you're being asked, okay, what security do I need to put in place to get trust? On the privacy side, it's more amorphous. It's more difficult. I can't say, well, put 2FA in and you'll get trust. I have to start thinking about this sort of much broader, almost philosophy behind it. And when you then look at that, what I think is really interesting is it is the company, it is the sector, it is your geography, but it's also beyond that. It's almost into the brand. It's into the nature of the organization. When I first started 20 years ago in privacy, I was working for the BBC. Now, the BBC, media organization, quite low down the list in trust terms globally on your survey. And yet I knew full well that the BBC had a very high level of individual trust, but that because of that, we were held to a higher standard than many of our competitors. The audience expected the BBC to do things in a particular way. And I don't think that's completely unique. I think when you look at many areas, you look at, say, retail, there's often a leading store who've been there for decades, sometimes longer than that, and they have integrated into the fabric of the society of that country, and they are held to a higher standard than somebody who arrived, 5 years ago, because the brand expectation is there. So when people say to me about how do I get trust? You say, well, it's actually good old fashioned risk analysis. Where is your risk in the marketplace? If you lost customer data, how many of your customers would be furious? Fine, nearly all of them. How many would leave? Where would they go? And if you're there based on price alone, you're at the bottom of the market, you're pile it high, sell it cheap, then actually they probably have lower expectations of trust for you. But if you're the leading proponent in that market, it doesn't matter the geography, it doesn't matter almost the sector, they will have higher expectations. And you therefore have to balance your risk and how much money you put into both the security and the philosophy of privacy around how you use people's data to get that trust. And it seems to me that in that sense, you can gauge it and can make quite sophisticated expectations of yourself on the behalf of your consumers or your clients because of how you are positioned in that environment.
Yeah, I think, if I may, Steve, I think there are so many great points in what you just said, James. One thing that actually stands out is today we are speaking to customers in industries where you would generally expect that maybe the notion of trust or security is not that important. But then you tend to realize that within those organizations, the chief digital officer, for instance, or the chief information officer, for instance, who are in charge of building those digital initiatives or interactions for those external users, they are actually looking at privacy and security as a differentiator, right? So a luxury brand, for instance, that we have been doing a project with quite recently, they have millions of customers, right, which are spread across Europe and the Americas for most part. And perhaps by virtue of being a European brand themselves and with this whole GDPR thing that's happening, maybe there's that higher level of consciousness of this particular area. But you can tell in the conversations that they're not doing it just for the regulatory compliance reasons. You can tell that they genuinely want to do it because they feel it's A, the right thing to do, and then B, they know that it can eventually turn into a differentiator for them in terms of a digital brand. Because some of the norms that you might already have had in your physical lives do not always work in the digital realm. The second part is to make it a part of your culture as an organization that is delivering those digital services. And this is why we have this notion of something called privacy by design. It's not necessarily a very technical term, but I think it really expresses the notion of what we're trying to achieve, which is the culture of knowing that privacy is important in every digital service or every digital product that you're building. And when you're thinking in the privacy by design fashion, you're ensuring that whatever products you're developing, they're already factoring in the notion of privacy at many different touch points that you're having with your users. So it's kind of like a mindset change that organizations need to go through in order to be better equipped to actually address those really evolving needs of the new customer or the new user, for instance.
I mean, I absolutely agree. And privacy by design is, I think, interesting and key because, as you say, firstly, it helps them get to that culture change. But what's really interesting, I think, about it is that it starts saying you can do this in a way which actually reduces friction. You can actually achieve that balance through privacy by design because you're not having to bolt it on at the end of the process. If you start thinking about things, and I remember sort of trying to get user experience teams. Whenever I'm working with a new client and they've got a sort of big digital footprint and they've got a UX team, I say, can I go and talk to them early on? And they go, well, they'll hate you because you're compliance and they won't want you anywhere near them. And I'm going, no, I want to make that as friction free as they do. And if I can do it in a way so that privacy is built in, then actually I'm going to make your job simpler, because you'll have fewer pop-ups, you'll have fewer things where the compliance people will come along and moan and put things in afterwards. And if you can win them over, they can suddenly become your advocates. They can say, we've been told we've got to put this interstitial page in. It doesn't look as if we need it. If we can do this, do you agree, James? I'm going, yeah, fine, go ahead, get rid of that interstitial. And it does seem to me that we can actually get people who at present are almost sort of at least antipathetic, if not positively aggressive towards security and privacy, on our side by saying, we want to make this a good customer experience too. We're not just in it for the compliance. Yeah, and I think that's the point you're making. If we can go with the grain of the culture, it becomes so much easier to win people over.
And it really is the grain of the culture. I love the idea of moving the privacy issue further up the chain. It's kind of like shift left for privacy in the design process. But I was thinking about some of the most infamous data breaches of the past few years, especially large name retailers or membership-based organizations. These breaches happen. They hit the news cycle and then they fade away. In the end, do customers really care that much? We're looking here at the importance of trust, with the assumption that consumers are actually focused on that. Wouldn't it be cheaper just to simply ride through the storm and even the attached class action lawsuit rather than undertake the costs of improving trust?
For me, I think one of the biggest concerns with this line of thinking is we're still looking at the fear-mongering tactic, right? Saying, oh, you know what, if you don't have these security or privacy measures in place, potentially it can lead to fines and maybe even commercial repercussions from your customer. I take a step back, right, and say, isn't this a more responsible thing to do anyway? You know what I mean? As a brand, as a company, are you not responsible for making sure that you are respecting the privacy of your users or your consumers, for that matter? But then again, that's basically a more philosophical discussion, perhaps. We all know the harsh realities are quite different, right? I mean, some companies, they're willing to actually take that hit because they've actually done that analysis in the first place. And they have to, because at the end of the day, in some shape or form, every company that's out there that has some sort of a digital presence is open to those risks. If it was company A yesterday, it's going to be company B tomorrow. But I think companies are becoming a lot more resilient in addressing some of these threats as well, not just because of the security controls, but everything else that goes around it as well in terms of communication. And I think something like GDPR has played a huge part over there as well, right? Because they're actually giving you actual timelines. If you have a breach on a certain date, you have X amount of time to actually communicate it to your users as well. So I think regulation is actually helping with some of those areas as well. I guess where I'm going with this is with the technology, but then on top of that, with the regulation, those things are starting to get automatically enforced in some shape or form, where companies not only need to think about the security controls themselves, but everything adjacent to those controls as well, because that ties in a lot to whether they can actually absorb a blow of that sort, as in whether they can actually manage the expectations of their consumers, for instance, if such a breach were to take place, whether they can actually convince the regulatory authorities that they did everything in their power to actually handle the situation, but it still just happened. I feel that companies are becoming a lot more resilient that way, and it is still a question of the context for most companies.
Steve, I'd say when you start having those conversations with the boards, what's interesting is their individual motivation. The CFO is there just to save the money. The CISO is there to try and keep them safe. The PO is there to say you've got to look after people's data, etc., etc. And you've got the competing things. But your fundamental point, why would we spend this money? It's changing now anyway. They're beginning to see this as part of what's happening. And I think my answer, therefore, we're back to that risk analysis. If you are so big too big to fail, as they're talking about in banking internationally, they can probably say, well, we can take that hit. And I would be saying to the board there, well, yeah, that's fine. You probably can as a one-off, and your customers won't all desert you. But the amount of management time and effort that's going to go into that, the amount of legal fees before you even get into the regulatory fines and all the rest of it, it's more about, do you really want to be doing this? The old sort of British naval phrase, spoiling the ship for a ha'porth of tar. You're not quite finishing it off. And actually, it doesn't make sense in risk terms to do that. It doesn't mean you have to have gold-plated everything. And I think that's the other thing, where I am finding a lot of clients are going, I don't want to force my people to actually have 2FA. It's just not what my clients are expecting. I'm saying no, but they probably expect a secure website that's up to date and hasn't got SQL holes all over it. So actually, what are you saying? Well, you're saying you want to be in the middle of the pack. Okay, that's fine. You don't want to be the leader. That's okay. But frankly, neither do you want to be the straggler at the back, because that's where another risk lies. So I would be talking to them and saying, okay, let's look at your industry. Let's look at online services, online sales. Where are they? Where are your competitors in that sense? And put yourself securely in the center of that. If you don't want to be a market leader, if it's not a differentiator for you, which, as we're saying, as Hyder pointed out, for some people it's now a differentiator. But being right at the back and then having a catastrophic hack could well be a really, really bad thing, whatever your industry.
And I think something that's really interesting about this whole equation is technology. It's always playing catch up. If you look at it, I think some of these problems have been quite obvious, right? As in, okay, so we have spoken about the whole culture of trying to bake in privacy and security into your digital processes as well as your digital products, for instance. How do you actually literally do it? And that's essentially where you have capabilities like adaptive access or risk-based authentication. It takes an assessment of your risk level. Certain actions of a certain user, they seem a lot more risky, or the type of transaction that they're conducting right now. If it's a $10 transaction versus if it's a $1,000 transaction, all of these different factors, they dictate the risk associated with a certain transaction. So risk-based authentication is basically factoring in all of those things that I just mentioned and dozens, if not hundreds more, to have a calculation of risk and then determining what is the appropriate level of authentication that you need for that particular transaction. So sometimes maybe you don't need any authentication at all because this particular user had authenticated maybe a couple of days ago, and that session is still alive and you can still go ahead with the transaction. However, if you're about to do a financial transaction, which is a continuation of whatever it is that you were doing earlier, then you want to make sure that you step up the level of security there and then. So again, I think there's a good set of tools and skills available now to actually make some of those things happen. And same goes with something called progressive profiling. Historically speaking, and you don't have to go that far back, I think some of the companies still actually do it, which is throw everything up front, right? So if you need to download a white paper, for instance, a simple example from a company's website, they want to know everything about you. They even want to know where you live, what your zip code is, and all those things. No, I mean, that's just wrong. You don't need that information as a company. You're just increasing your liability by holding all that data to begin with just to hand over a PDF to somebody. But having something like progressive profiling is basically allowing companies that are building those digital channels to collect information progressively. And what that essentially means is at your first interaction, maybe you just need the person's email address to initiate that interaction with them, right? So you don't force them to fill out an A4 sized form. Maybe a few steps later, once they've already been onboarded, now maybe, yes, in order to serve them better, maybe you need to know where they live, which city they live in, for instance. Then, yes, within that digital interaction, somewhere you can bake in the notion of collecting that additional information from them. And that's essentially how you try to strike that balance as a company. If you have those different channels on which you're interacting with them, progressively collect data rather than hogging on it, essentially.
I absolutely agree. And also, you then get into this idea of actually sort of being very precise about why you want the data. You're explaining it as you go along, because often people don't understand why you're wanting all of this data that you seem to, in inverted commas, need. This website is demanding of you. While I was still at the BBC, there's a division, CBBC, Children's BBC. And obviously, kids want to interact with their favourite programmes, with their presenters. When I first took over that role, there was a consultant reporter who came in and said, well, basically, I'd advise that the BBC stop dealing with children's data because it's too risky. I'm thinking, yeah, but you completely then dismissing the needs of a huge and important sector, and we can actually help them develop those privacy-friendly, et cetera, et cetera. And when I made, whenever a new member of staff, I tried to make sure they always had a chance to work on the CBBC programme, because actually the way in which you get data, you explain it properly. And if you go in with that mindset, you start saying, we can explain why we need this at this moment in our relationship with you. That itself builds trust. They haven't needed it now. I now see why they need it at this point. Therefore, I'm more willing to trust them to give them data later on when they next ask for it. So it's not only good, security. It's good privacy. It's good psychology. But it's good for the brand to understand. It's good for that company to think through, when do we need that from that particular customer, consumer, audience member, whatever it is? So this appropriateness, I think, is something that has often been missing out of the conversation, because we've either had the regulatory side saying you're collecting too much, privacy and security stuck in the middle, and marketing over here saying we want it all, we want it all. And there's sort of a balance between those, which is actually, again, as we've said, it's going to move, it's going to change. But I think we are getting into a better space where we can understand that we need to explain. It's about transparency. It's explaining why we want this stuff, not just demanding it because we can.
And my other thought, while you were discussing the sophistication of certain companies to create these policies and build the trust, is that with a list like this, there's always one group at the end of the list, the laggards at the bottom in terms of achieving trust. And in this case, in this time, in this report, it's the logistics industry. And this sort of shines a light on the fact that none of these organizations, companies or sectors, none of them work in a vacuum. As a company, no matter what industry you are in, you're going to have a logistics company or numerous ones that are supplying you your materials and services. So what are your thoughts? If we can pose this as sort of a crystal ball question, we've got a bell curve here. You've got some really great leaders who are doing terrifically at picking up on consumer security and on trust. You've got a big mass in the middle of companies trying to figure it all out. And then you've got the laggards at the end, which in this case happen to be in the logistics industry right now, who are in a less favorable position. But they, too, are physically connected to everyone else. We can't get away from these connections. So is there a red flag that stands out for you when it comes to this kind of interrelationship that we all have on this bell curve? Regardless where you sit, you are connected to everyone else.
There's a lot that different industries can potentially learn from other industries. I think some of the industries were kind of ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about security, thinking about privacy, and then the intersection of security, privacy, as well as user experience when building those digital interactions. I would say when we're speaking about logistics companies, perhaps the survey is not that surprising in terms of those results because they haven't really had that need essentially to think about these problems to begin with.
All right.
The issue is today, the whole notion of going digital, if you want to call it that, whether that means just having a website or having a website and an app and other digital channels as well, means essentially you're competing at the same level as many other technology companies, for instance, who are setting the bar in terms of the expectations or the standards for some of these digital interactions. It's not just being concerned about the fines and the regulation that we were speaking about earlier, but now being the fact that you're not just competing in terms of your digital presence with your conventional competitors, but sometimes these folks from certain other industries who have perhaps had an edge on you in terms of building those digital interactions. It's extremely important for different industries to learn. I feel in the digital realm, this notion of digital trust is very strongly tied to your brand. So the impact can be different if you have a breach as a bank or an insurance company versus a breach as a logistics company. Just because the nature of the personal information that you're actually storing can actually mean different impacts. But then at the end of it, if you look at interactions, we're not just looking at consumers. Logistics companies have a lot of B2B interactions as well. Logistic companies working with other logistic companies. We have one of our customers, which is basically an insurance company for the transport industry. And one of the problems that they have been trying to solve is they want to build digital interactions with fleet managers and then subsequently to the drivers as well. So again, how do you actually handle that? Because those users, if they will be using your digital platforms to interact with your brand, the same GDPR requirements or any other privacy regulation applies on them as well, right? And if there's a breach, it's still a breach and you're still liable. So that's what I mean, that you're now competing with digital companies from totally different industries who have already set the bar in terms of where privacy should be or where security should be. I don't think companies in any industry can actually afford to just sit back and not think about these issues. Yes, the importance and the impact can vary, but just like the example that I just gave about that insurance company, right? They understood this and they really wanted to make sure that when they're building those digital interactions for drivers, for instance, sometimes potentially they might not be as tech savvy as some of the other audiences. So they have to strike that balance of making sure that they're building that right user experience for them as well. The great thing is we have the tools and technologies to make those kind of interactions happen. Technology is no longer the excuse for not building those right user experiences.
I think the point that comes out of that, picking up on your original question, Steve, about that bell curve, and I completely agree with Haidar on this, that it doesn't matter where you are on that, it's your third-party vendors and suppliers as well. You can be an absolute market leader, and if you use a logistics firm or a financial payments firm or whatever, I mean, some of the biggest cyber risks are actually those unseen contracts. I've had a couple of clients who were caught in a financial support company breach, and most of the people in that company didn't know they even used this other organization. So the third-party management thing is both the scariest and sometimes the most complex. I mean, some of the clients I work with have got thousands of contracts. How on earth are they going to do true third-party due diligence on all of those contracts? Well, you can't. So you've got to do a risk approach. But if there is a sector has got problems, and I think looking at the report, clearly logistics is going to be one of those, then you might start thinking, okay, how are we doing fulfillment? Where is the risk in our overall delivery system? And, where is the most personal data? And you can do these things. You can narrow that risk down. You don't have to boil the ocean. You can take it a pail at a time. And it seems to me that that's the message again. You look at what's achievable and, again, set that risk profile according to the risk that you inherently have and what you're willing to accept. But I think the other thing about the bell curve is that, again, I'm sure these will change and have been changing. Probably the regulatory impact is high there. So when it's governmental, when it's banking, insurance, they're likely to be at the leading edge because they're under the most pressure. But increasingly with things like the European Digital Market Act. And I know that's only a particular aspect of the online digital world, but we're beginning to see more and more regulation saying the digital space is no longer going to be the free for all, the Wild West that it started out as. And I think we need to be saying to clients, you've got to understand there will be increasing pressures in this place, not just from your customers, but also from the political environment. So you might as well start getting your ducks in a row before you're forced to.
So we're coming to the conclusion of this meeting here today. Really great meeting, by the way. Lots of great wisdom, not only about privacy technology and consumer acceptance, but also about the necessity for companies to perhaps broaden their scope of observation, watching what other companies in other sectors are doing. And as we've seen, at the end of the day, we're all in this great big swimming pool together, and whatever is in there is shared by everyone. So before we conclude, any thoughts? Hader?
I think something that I'd probably re-emphasize, look at your context as an organization, look at your context as a brand. It's extremely important that you build your own equation or you build your own formula for digital trust. How much friction can you afford to have in your digital interactions? How much privacy do you actually need? How much data do you actually need to collect from your consumers as well? If you don't need data, don't try to hog on data, as in it's not going to help you. So I think it's extremely important to know that formula, to know that equation, because only then you're able to build the right mechanisms that can actually help you in becoming a more trusted brand. Something that we endeavored on as Thales in 2022, we actually acquired a company called One Welcome, which actually delivers something called Customer Identity and Access Management capabilities, CIAM. And what we loved about One Welcome was they thought about their own products in the privacy by design fashion, whereby the whole notion of privacy and consent management is baked into their particular product and the capabilities that it offers to our customers. So I know I mentioned one insurance company, for instance, as part of our discussions. You'll see some of the publicly available references that we have as well, like the European Space Agency, the European Central Bank. These are serious entities, right, who cannot mess around on the privacy front themselves as well. Where I'm essentially going with this is there are tools and technologies available now that help organizations to actually build those security controls, those privacy controls in a very reduced friction manner. I mean, you can easily include those capabilities in your products and your offers when you're interacting with users digitally. Go ahead and use them.
And James, how about yourself? Any further closing points?
I think probably that there isn't an answer. There is a continuing conversation in this space. It's going to carry on. It's going to change. There are going to be people getting better, people who fall foul of things. And trust is something that can be destroyed very easily and yet is very hard to build. There isn't a simple solution. Stop looking for one. And this is a conversation you're going to have to carry on having. And once the senior staff inside an organization start realizing that this isn't a bolt-on, this is fundamental to their business model. This is just going to be there, like finance is going to be there, like operations are going to be there. This is no longer something that's just done because you can keep the regulator quiet by doing it. It's going to be there, it's going to be front and center, and the people who understand that sooner will probably get benefit out of this change.
Well, I feel this conversation has been a marvelous addendum to the report itself, some clear-eyed analysis from both of you, both within Thales and, of course, from the perspective of a privacy expert out there in the wild. I so enjoyed listening to you both. Hader Iqbal, who looks after product marketing for Thales Identity and Access Management business. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think some amazing insight from James as well. So appreciate you having both of us over here as well. And yeah, I hope that people are able to walk away with some actionable insights from this discussion as well. It was great to be here. Thanks.
And James Leeton Gray, Director at the Privacy Practice, thank you as well.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to go away now and try and rethink all of my communications with my clients on the basis and start them getting to read the report.
To help James direct his clients to the report, as well as for you, our listeners, its title, once again, is the 2024 Digital Trust Index, with the subtitle, Building Digital Experiences that Enhance Consumer Trust. You can search for that term, or you can go to cpl.thalesgroup.com/digital-trust-index. But to make things easier, the link is also in the show notes to this episode. And remember, if you like what you hear in this podcast series, please be sure to subscribe and tell a friend or a colleague or a client or all of them about the Thales Security Sessions podcast. We are going to be back again soon with another episode and another discussion on the topics that you need to know about to successfully carry on in the business of information security. So until then, I'm Steve Prentice. Thanks for listening.